Hello, my name is Alex Ars, and in today's video I'm going to talk about why people in the early medieval period were fascinated by prehistoric monuments. Welcome back. So in today's episode we're going to be focusing a lot on Barrows and Henges, which are Bronze Age and late Neolithic monuments in the landscape. So we don't really fully understand, and also I have to caveat this, I'm not a prehistorian. I love the late Roman period, I love the early medieval period, that's my thing. So if I get something wrong and you're a prehistorian and you're suddenly going, well, obviously he needs to know about this and please put it in the comments. I'm always willing to learn and I would like to just find out more. So please, I'm not doing this to wind you up. It's more the fact that that's not my area. I have read about it. I don't know as much about it as I do about other periods. What you generally find is these are Bronze Age and late Neolithic monuments in the landscape. And what we find is they really attract early medieval interest as focal points. Now what you get is you have these monuments are noticed in the landscape. And while you do sometimes see them being used in the Roman period, it's much more common in the early medieval period. And it might be that these are already known within the landscape as being key focal points. So people would know and see them. You're walking along the countryside, you see these mounds and you start gathering with them. And we can see that as well in other parts of Northern Europe. So places like Denmark, Germany, places like that. These are focal points across there as well. So it could be that when people are migrating into the British Isles, they see something that they recognize from back home, and so they start adopting them and seeing that as something that they understand and gather around as well. It's really interesting that a lot of the Great Hall complexes, so we're talking about stuff like Yeavering, Limeage, places like that, they are built or focused around previous prehistoric monuments. And I know Yeavering quite well. So at Yeavering, you find that there is a Bronze Age mound, there's two henges, and they are focal points for how the layout of the entire site is basically developed. What is going on then is what we find is that they're used as well for other purposes too. So in the 6th century, what we find is that you see people are buried into previous Bronze Age barrows. And when you're buried into them, they're like round barrows. Round barrows make up 61% of prehistoric monuments that are utilized in this period, which is absolutely fascinating. And in the 6th century, you get radial burials. So what you do is people are buried into it almost in a full circular fashion, and they're all the way around with their heads focused into the center of the burial and their feet pointing outwards, and you get this wonderful almost like clock face with all of the burials into the barrow. Then what you find is in the 7th century the focus becomes on the south and the east. You get a cluster in the south, cluster in the east, and then the rest of the area isn't really used. So we don't know what's going on there. But it's what happens, and it's just a really interesting thing. But then by the sort of the middle and the end to the end of the 7th century, this dies off entirely. There are examples of barrows being erected though from scratch in the 7th century. So this is a case of stuff like the street house burial. So you see the street house princess in her bed burial. She is covered by a barrow that is not Bronze Age. So it could be that they know that these barrows are important, that people have been using barrows for burial, and then they're erecting them as a way of basically mirroring these previous prehistoric monuments, and so it comes back into fashion. So across Britain you do see new burials happening as well. And these actual barrows are so important that they attract burials all over the place. One of my favourite examples is actually the Eslington sword. So the Eslington sword was a sword that was discovered by a metal detectorist, and it's an example of a princely burial or a high status warrior burial from the 6th century Northumbria. And what they found was when they were excavating the area where they think the burial came from, because it was disturbed by ploughing, it's a natural mound in the landscape that looks like a barrow. And when it looks like a barrow, it actually attracted a Bronze Age burial into it. So the Bronze Age people had found the ready-made barrow, they buried into it, and then later on in the early medieval period, someone comes along and they bury another person into it with his pattern welded sword and all of his items, which look like, parts of a shield and things like that. But unfortunately his body was just destroyed by the acidic soils, so there was no evidence of him anymore, but there were little bits of his items. So his sword had been ritually broken, folded over, and his dagger was in the middle of it. And if you're interested, I can do another video on that in more depth in the future. But that was a case where a natural feature in the landscape had looked like a barrow and had actually attracted people in the Bronze Age and then had been reused in the early medieval period. So that's fascinating again. Going back to Yevering, there was a henge that had been used for ironworking. So again, this prehistoric site, which is seen as an important site in the landscape, attracts an important task. And metalworkers are often seen as quite itinerant in the early medieval period. They would move around the place from place to place, and they were seen as semi-magical individuals as well. When they're seen as semi-magical individuals, it's also important to note that even Jesus' father, Joseph, was seen as a metal worker often in the early medieval period, because the word in Latin can mean carpenter, stonemason, or metal worker. So there's a really interesting one there, that, you know, we today see Joseph, Jesus' father, as a carpenter, but he could have been a stonemason or a metal worker as well when you're looking at the Latin language. So when you're looking at these, why are they doing it? Why are they doing these barrows and these henges? Why are they focusing on prehistoric monuments? And one of the biggest theories is to claim the landscape. So, you know, these are monuments that are important to previous populations, so we're going to take them over, and therefore we are putting our power onto the landscape. Now, it could be that, or it could be more to what I suggested at the start, is that it's what they did back home, so they just kept doing it here. And it wasn't a case of the fact that they were coming in to be like jack-booted individuals, to put their boot upon the neck of the native Britons and force them into supplication to their power. It could have just been, you know, this is what we do, this is our tradition, this is how we interact with the monuments. Or it could be a brand new fashion. Something that they've started doing over here, because you have a mixing of ideas between the native British population and the incoming Anglo-Saxon population, and they find something that works for them. Just like today, how people come up with new clothing fashions, new ways of doing things, you know, ways of having festivals. If you think about the ways we do festivals today, you know, now we have vegan festivals, or we have, you know, people coming together and having silent discos and stuff like that. It's different fashions for things at different times that become popular. So it could be that it just was, instead of, you know, trying to force power onto other people, it was just a fashionable thing to do. But we do know by the end of the 7th century it stops, and you move into a new phase in the 8th century with different focuses, much more focused in other ways of doing burial and interaction. So that's why I find it really interesting looking at these prehistoric monuments and going, how were people interacting with them, especially in the 5th to the 7th century, when they're coming in, new traditions are being formed by, as I believe, the mixing of people together. But I'd love to hear what you think in the comment section. Put your ideas down there, let's have a chat. Please stay civil, it always helps things. But alongside that as well, as always, we've come to the end of the video, and if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe. It helps the channel grow and more people get to share in this amazing history, and I love sharing it with people as well. If you'd like to support me further, please do support me with my Patreon on my Coffee account, which can be found in the description. That just means that I can basically ring fence some time, sit down, make these videos for you, and it just helps me within my calendar to do that. Finally, I hope you've really enjoyed the video today, and I look forward to seeing you in another video in the near future. But until then, stay safe and well, and thank you so much for watching.